Imagine a battle-hardened Navy SEAL and his scarred German shepherd, Maverick, standing at a weathered doorstep, only to find a 60-year-old grandmother trembling as she mops the floor with a newborn strapped to her back. The house is in ruins. The hero who should have been here is gone, and the woman he loved has vanished. This isn't the homecoming they imagined, but it's the mission they were born for. In the wild, we never leave a wounded soul behind. This is a journey of shadows, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bond of a new family. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? I want to know how far this story has spread. Please subscribe to support my journey. The morning in Iowa arrives with a heavy gray blanket of mist that clings to the endless cornfields like a ghost that refuses to leave. The air is damp, smelling of rich earth and the sharp, metallic scent of coming rain. It is the kind of quiet that feels fragile, as if a single loud noise could shatter the entire horizon. Evan Miller grips the steering wheel of his rusted Ford F-150, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. Evan is 32, but his face carries the maps of a much older man. He is tall, built like a lighthouse, sturdy and unyielding, with shoulders that seem to carry the invisible weight of a fallen sky. His hair is a short, military buzz of sun-bleached brown, and his eyes, a piercing, storm cloud blue, rarely stay still. They are restless eyes, the eyes of a man who has seen horizons burn and friends fall. He wears a faded tactical shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by a jagged scar that looks like a lightning bolt, a souvenir from a roadside bomb in a land far from here. Beside him, sitting as rigid as a stone monument, is Maverick. He is a 5-year-old German shepherd, a powerhouse of muscle and instinct, wrapped in a thick, tan and black coat that has lost its shine to the dust of foreign deserts. Maverick isn't just a dog, he's a living shadow. His right ear has a jagged notch missing from the tip, and his amber eyes are deep, intelligent, and perpetually narrowed in a gaze that scans the rearview mirror every few seconds. He doesn't pant, he doesn't whine. He sits in that passenger seat as if he is still patrolling the lethal corridors of Fallujah, his body vibrating with a silent, controlled energy. In Evan's breast pocket, resting right against his heart, is a dented brass compass and a Silver Star medal. They belong to Leo, his best friend, the man who stepped in front of a bullet so Evan could keep breathing. The truck bounces as it hits a deep pothole on the gravel road, and for a split second, Evan isn't in Iowa anymore. The sound of the suspension bottoming out mimics the thud of a mortar hitting the sand. Evan's heart hammers against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming. His breath hitches, and a cold sweat breaks across his brow, stinging his eyes. He feels the phantom weight of his combat gear, the heat of the sun, the smell of cordite. A soft, warm weight presses against his knee. Maverick has shifted. The dog doesn't bark to wake him from the flashback. Instead, he leans his massive head against Evan's leg, applying just enough pressure to ground him to the present. Evan exhales, a long, shuddering breath, and reaches down to bury his fingers in Maverick's thick fur. "I'm okay, buddy," Evan whispers, his voice gravelly and thin. "We're almost there." They are heading towards Cedar Creek, a small town that used to represent a dream. It was supposed to be the place where two brothers in arms would open a garage, drink cold beers on the porch, and grow old listening to the crickets. But as the town's water tower appears through the mist, it looks less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. Evan pulls the truck into a roadside diner called the Rusty Anchor. It's a low-slung building with peeling white paint and a neon sign that flickers like a dying heartbeat. He needs coffee, but more than that, he needs a moment to stop the world from spinning. Inside, the diner smells of burnt grease and stale tobacco. At a corner table sit 3 men, older, with caps that say Vietnam Veteran and Korea. One of them, a man named Silas, catches Evan's eye. Silas is in his late 70s, with a face like a dried apple and hands that look like gnarled tree roots. He notices the faded seal trident tattooed on Evan's inner wrist as he reaches for a menu. "Son," Silas calls out, his voice a friendly rumble. "We don't see many of your kind around these parts. Come, sit. Let us buy a hero a drink. Coffee, beer, whatever you need." Evan freezes. The word hero tastes like ash in his mouth. He thinks of Leo, buried in a box, and himself, standing here in the air-conditioned quiet. He feels a surge of shame so violent, it almost makes him nauseous. "No thank you," Evan says, his voice tight, refusing to meet Silas's kind gaze. "I'm just passing through." He turns back toward the door, his heart beginning to race again, that familiar tightness returning to his chest. He feels exposed, like a target in an open field. Maverick is already waiting by the door, his ears pricked forward. As Evan nears, the dog senses the spike in his master's adrenaline. Maverick nudges Evan's hand firmly, stepping into his path to slow him down, forcing Evan to focus on the rhythmic tuck of the dog's ears, rather than the buzzing in his own head. As they walk back to the truck, Evan overhears two men in suits standing by a sleek black SUV. One of them is holding a clipboard, pointing toward the sprawling cornfields. "The old lady at the Miller-Leo place won't hold out much longer," the younger man says, his voice oily and sharp. He's wearing a suit that's too expensive for a town that bleeds rust. This is Marcus, a land developer with eyes as cold as a shark's. "She's behind on taxes. Once we get that plot, we control the whole eastern corridor. The corporate office wants that land cleared by winter." Evan stops in his tracks. Maverick let out a low, guttural vibration in his chest. Not quite a growl, but a warning. The Miller-Leo place. That was the name they had picked for their dream. Evan realizes with a jolt of cold fury that the old lady they are talking about is Martha, Leo's mother. He climbs back into the Ford, the engine roaring to life with a defiant growl. He doesn't look at the men in suits, but he feels their eyes on his rusted truck. He shifts the gear into drive, his purpose shifting from a somber visit to something else entirely. The road ahead is gray, the ghosts of his past are still screaming in the wind, but as he looks at the notched ear of the dog beside him and feels the metal in his pocket, Evan Miller knows his war isn't over. It has just changed locations. He drives toward the edge of town, toward a house he hasn't seen in a decade, carrying the weight of a dead man's honor, and the sudden, sharp realization that the family he left behind is being circled by vultures. The mist doesn't lift, but Evan's vision has never been clearer. The gravel driveway of the Miller farmstead groaned under the tires of Evan's truck, a sound that felt far too loud in the suffocating stillness of the afternoon. As the engine died, the silence that rushed in was not the peaceful quiet of the countryside. It was a heavy, stagnant air that tasted of neglect and forgotten things. The vibrant flower beds Leo used to brag about in, the trenches, the ones he said his mother, Martha, tended to with the precision of a master artist, were gone, replaced by choked weeds and the skeletal remains of rose bushes. The farmhouse itself looked like a wounded animal, its white paint peeling away in long, curled strips like dead skin, and the porch sagging under the weight of a decade of unanswered prayers. Evan stepped out of the truck, his boots clicking hollowly on the hard-packed dirt. Maverick followed, his nose twitching, his body low and tense. The dog didn't wag his tail. He sensed the grief radiating from the timber of the house before they even reached the door. Evan didn't knock. The door was slightly ajar, hanging off a loose hinge that gave a mournful shriek as he pushed it open. The interior was shrouded in a dim, sickly light, filtered through grime-streaked windows. The air was thick with the smell of sour milk, unwashed linoleum, and the sharp, antiseptic scent of cheap liniment. As he moved toward the kitchen, the scene that met him was a punch to the gut. Martha Miller was on her knees in the center of the room. At 60 years old, she looked 80. She was a small woman, once sturdy and bright-eyed, but now her frame was gaunt, her spine curved like a bow under a burden too great to bear. Her hair, a tangled nest of silver, escaped from a fraying bun, and her skin was the color of parchment. She was desperately trying to mop up a puddle of spilled soup with a ragged towel, her movements jerky and pained by the advanced arthritis that had swollen her knuckles into angry red knots. Strapped to her back in a faded, stained carrier was a tiny infant, no more than 3 months old, whose face was a mask of crimson as he wailed with a hunger that vibrated through the floorboards. "Martha?" Evan's voice was a whisper, cracked and uncertain. The woman froze. She looked up, her eyes clouded with cataracts and exhaustion, blinking slowly as if she were staring directly into the sun. For a long moment, she didn't speak. She looked at Evan, then at the shadow of Maverick behind him, and a shuddering breath escaped her lips. "Leo?" she gasped, her voice a ghostly rasp. "No," Evan replied, his heart breaking in a way it never had on the battlefield. "It's Evan, Martha. It's Evan Miller." The light in her eyes flickered and died, replaced by a hollow, aching recognition. She didn't cry. She seemed beyond the reach of tears. "He's not coming, is he?" she asked, turning her gaze back to the spilled soup. "I knew it when the man in the suit came, but I thought maybe the world wasn't that cruel." Maverick moved then, bypassing Evan with a slow, deliberate grace. The massive German shepherd approached the kneeling woman. Martha flinched instinctively, but Maverick didn't growl. He stepped closer until his warm flank pressed against her trembling shoulder, providing a solid pillar of heat. Then, he turned his head toward the infant strapped to her back. The baby, Leo Jr., was flailing his tiny, translucent hands in the air, his cries reaching a fever pitch. Maverick leaned in and gently, with the tenderness of a mother, licked the child's small, salty palm. The effect was instantaneous. The baby's crying broke into a surprised hiccup, then a soft, wet snuffle. Leo Jr. grabbed a handful of Maverick's thick fur, his tiny fingers tangling in the black and tan coat, and a miraculous silence descended upon the kitchen. Evan helped Martha to a rickety wooden chair, his hands steady despite the tremor in his soul. As he moved through the house to find a clean bottle, he realized with a jolt of horror what was missing. There were no photographs. In a home that should have been a shrine to a fallen hero, there was not a single image of Leo. No childhood portraits, no high school football shots, no military honors. The walls were bare, marked only by the rectangular shadows where frames used to hang. "I had to take them down, Evan," Martha whispered, sensing his confusion as she rocked the now quiet baby. "Every time I saw his smile, I remembered the way the air felt when they told me he was gone. It was like drinking long dead water. And Sarah, she couldn't stand the sight of him either, not after she realized the money wasn't enough." The mention of Sarah brought a cold hardness to Evan's chest. Sarah had been the girl Leo adored, a tall, willow-thin woman with hair like spun honey and a laugh that could jumpstart a heart. But that was the Sarah of the past. The woman who had remained was a creature of sharp angles and a soul made of glass. According to Martha, the news of Leo's death had snapped something inside her, but not in the way of grief. It was a cold, calculated survival instinct. Sarah had waited just long enough to collect the initial military death gratuity and the life insurance payout, a sum that should have secured the farm for generations. Instead, 3 weeks ago, she had packed a single suitcase, emptied the bank accounts, and driven away in the middle of the night, leaving her 3-month-old son and her crippled mother-in-law to fend for themselves against the mounting property taxes and the circling vultures of the debt collectors. "She said he owed her a life he couldn't give," Martha said, her voice devoid of anger, filled only with a crushing weariness. She left a note saying the boy reminded her too much of a dead man's mistakes. "Now the county says if I don't pay the back taxes by the end of the month, they'll put us on the street. I don't mind for me, Evan. I've lived my time. But this little one, he's all that's left of my boy." Evan looked at the sink piled high with crusty dishes, the pantry that held only a few cans of beans, and the woman who was literally starving herself to keep a baby alive. He felt the weight of the silver star in his pocket, a piece of metal that felt mocking in the face of such raw, domestic ruin. Without a word, Evan rolled up his sleeves. He found a box of old detergent under the sink and began to run the water. It came out rusty at first, a deep orange that looked like dried blood, but he let it run until it turned clear and cold. Maverick stayed at Martha's feet, a silent guardian, his ears swiveling to track every sound from the hallway. Evan worked with a grim, focused efficiency. He scrubbed the dishes until the porcelain shone. He wiped down the counters, and he mopped the floor where the soup had spilled, his movements rhythmic and purposeful. He didn't offer empty platitudes or promises he couldn't keep. He simply began to reclaim the house from the filth and the silence. It was his first act of war in Cedar Creek, a war not fought with rifles, but with soap, water, and the refusal to let a brother's legacy be erased by the cowardice of those he left behind. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the kitchen floor, Evan Miller knew he wasn't going back to his tent. He was staying. For Leo, for Martha, and for the tiny boy who was currently sleeping, his hands still tucked into the fur of a war dog who had finally found something worth protecting. The transition from the battlefield to the quietude of Cedar Creek was a deception that Evan Miller struggled to navigate. While the house began to breathe again under his care, Evan remained a man living on the jagged edge of two worlds. He refused the comfort of the spare bedroom Martha offered, instead pitching a rugged, sand-colored military tent in the overgrown backyard. Beneath the vast, indifferent Iowa sky, Evan felt safer with only a thin layer of canvas between him and the night. The walls of a house felt like a trap, but the open air allowed him to hear the approach of the shadows that haunted his sleep. Maverick, ever the vigilant sentinel, slept at the tent's entrance, his ears twitching at the rhythmic song of the crickets, his body a warm, breathing tripwire for the nightmares that tried to claw their way into Evan's mind. Daylight brought a different kind of labor. Evan threw himself into the restoration of the farm with a desperate, grinding energy. He climbed onto the roof, his hammer striking rhythmic blows that echoed across the valley as he replaced the warped, sun-bleached shingles. He spent hours in the barn, grease up to his elbows, breathing life back into Leo's old 1978 Chevy Silverado. The truck was a rusted heap of memories, but as Evan cleaned the carburetor and replaced the spark plugs, he felt like he was stitching his friend's broken legacy back together. In the quiet afternoons, Evan took on a new role, mentor to a child who would never know his father's voice. He would sit on the porch, leaning against a sturdy oak pillar, with Leo Jr. resting in a small bassinet. Evan would pull out the stack of unsent letters he had retrieved from Leo's footlocker. His voice, usually harsh and clipped, would soften as he read aloud the words of a soldier dreaming of home. "We'll teach the boy to fish the creek, Ev," he read, his throat tightening. Reading these letters was a penance and a prayer. It was the only way Evan could quiet the voice in his head that asked why he was the one who got to come home. However, the piece of the farm was being watched by cold, calculating eyes. For 3 days, a sleek jet-black SUV with tinted windows had been idling at the edge of the gravel road, just beyond the property line. Inside sat a man Evan nicknamed the Shark, Marcus, the developer he had overheard at the diner. Marcus was a man who exuded a predatory cleanliness. He was mid-40s, with hair so perfectly slicked back it looked painted on, and a wardrobe of crisp white linen shirts that looked absurd against the dusty backdrop of Cedar Creek. He didn't come to talk, he came to intimidate, his presence a silent countdown for the tax debt that loomed over Martha like a guillotine. Maverick was the first to formalize the resistance. Without a single command from Evan, the German Shepherd took it upon himself to patrol the perimeter. He no longer spent his afternoons lounging in the shade. Instead, he stood like a bronze statue at the main gate, his amber eyes locked onto the black SUV. Whenever the vehicle crept a few inches closer, Maverick would let out a low, bone-deep rumble. Not a frantic bark, but the controlled warning of a professional soldier. His notch-eared silhouette against the setting sun was a clear message to Marcus. The territory was no longer undefended. The tension escalated when Evan found a manila envelope tucked into the mailbox. Inside was not a tax bill, but a predatory contract. It demanded that Martha sign over the deed to the property for a mere fraction of its value, barely enough to pay for a year in a cramped nursing home, or face immediate and aggressive legal eviction. The letter was signed by a shell corporation, but the scent of Marcus's expensive cologne seemed to cling to the paper. It was an ultimatum wrapped in legalese, a threat disguised as an offer. Evan's reaction was not one of panic, but of tactical preparation. He knew that men like Marcus didn't stop at letters. They eventually sent hands to do their dirty work. Drawing on his years of unconventional warfare, Evan began to turn the farmhouse into a fortress. He didn't use claymores or razor wire, but he utilized the tools of a ghost. He rigged a series of discrete, high-frequency motion sensors along the wood line, salvaged from old hardware he found in the barn, and modified with his own hands. He buried noisemakers, strips of thin metal and dry brush, under the windows to act as primitive acoustic alarms. He even spent an evening teaching Maverick a series of silent hand signals, refining the dog's ability to alert him to intruders without making a sound. Late one evening, as the shadows of the cornstalks grew long and jagged, Evan sat on the porch with Maverick at his side. He watched the taillights of the black SUV fade into the distance. He felt a strange sense of clarity he hadn't possessed since the day Leo died. He wasn't just a survivor anymore, he was a protector. He looked up at the eaves he had just repaired, and realized he was no longer just fulfilling a dead man's wish. He was making a vow of his own. Cedar Creek was no longer a place of ghosts, it was a line in the sand. And as Maverick's head rested on his boot, Evan knew that anyone trying to cross that line would find out exactly what happens when a SEAL decides he's finally found something worth fighting for on his own soil. The peace Evan had painstakingly built over the past week shattered with the arrival of a silver Mercedes-Benz that looked like a surgical blade cutting through the dusty morning air. It stopped abruptly in front of the farmhouse, and out stepped Sarah, the woman Leo had once called his North Star. She was tall, painfully thin, and moved with a jagged, nervous energy that suggested she was vibrating on a different frequency than the rest of the world. Her honey-colored hair was now dyed a stark, artificial blonde, pulled back so tight it made her eyes look predatory. She wore a designer dress that cost more than Martha's annual grocery budget, yet she looked exhausted, with dark circles poorly hidden by thick layers of foundation. Accompanying her was a man named Arthur Vance, a city lawyer with a face like a hawk and a suit that didn't have a single wrinkle. He carried a leather briefcase like a weapon, his gaze scanning the property with a mixture of disdain and calculation. Sarah didn't go to the bassinet to see her son. She didn't offer a hand to the mother-in-law she had abandoned. Instead, she stood in the center of the living room and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Look at this place, Martha," she spat, her voice tight and desperate. "It's a tomb. You're 60 years old, you can barely walk, and you think you're fit to raise a child in this rot? You're delusional." She turned to Vance, who began laying out papers on the coffee table, the very table where Leo used to do his homework. Sarah's objective was clear. She was claiming the house as the surviving spouse, intending to sell it immediately to Marcus's development group to settle the staggering gambling debts she had accumulated in the city's high-stakes underground. To Sarah, the farm wasn't a home. It was a chip she could cash in to keep the debt collectors from breaking her doors down. Evan emerged from the shadows of the hallway, Maverick silent at his side. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, as Evan's storm cloud eyes locked onto Sarah's. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stood with the terrifying stillness of a predator. "You've got a lot of nerve coming back here, Sarah," Evan said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Sarah flinched, her bravado flickering for a second. "Evan Miller," she hissed. "The hero who let my husband die. This is none of your business. This is family law." Evan didn't blink. He reached into his pocket and produced the brass compass and a weathered notebook, Leo's final logs. "Leo knew you were slipping long before we went on that last mission," Evan stated firmly. He opened the notebook to a page dated 2 days before the ambush. In Leo's unmistakable scrawl, he had written a clear directive, that in the event of his death, the property was to be held in a trust for Martha and Leo Jr., specifically citing Sarah's unstable financial habits as the reason. While the tension boiled in the living room, Maverick's ears suddenly swiveled toward the ceiling. He sensed a movement that didn't belong. Without a sound, the German shepherd slipped away and trotted up the creaking stairs to the attic. There, he found Sarah Len Lute trying to shove Leo's old footlocker and a collection of vintage war watches, items with immense sentimental and resale value, into a duffel bag. Maverick didn't attack. He simply planted his 90-pound frame directly in the doorway, blocking her exit. When Sarah turned and saw the notched-eared beast, his lips curled back to reveal white fangs and a guttural growl that vibrated the very floorboards. She froze. Her face turned a sickly shade of gray as she realized that Maverick wasn't a pet. He was a guardian who recognized a thief when he saw one. She dropped the duffel bag, her hands shaking so violently she had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. Downstairs, Evan was already 2 steps ahead. He had spent the previous night on a satellite phone with an old SEAL teammate, Viper Reed, who had transitioned into military law. Viper had provided Evan with the ammunition he needed, a mountain of evidence regarding Sarah's constructive abandonment. By leaving a 3-month-old infant with a physically disabled grandmother without financial support or a forwarding address for weeks, Sarah had effectively forfeited her parental rights under Iowa state law. Furthermore, Evan had discovered that the men Marcus had sent to watch the house weren't just developers. They were the same collectors Sarah owed money to. She wasn't just selling the house. She was being coerced into a fire sale to save her own skin. "The law isn't a shield for cowards, Arthur," Evan said, turning his gaze to the hawk-faced lawyer. "I've already filed a petition for emergency guardianship with the county sheriff. If you don't take your client and leave this property in the next 60 seconds, I'll have you arrested for trespassing and her for child endangerment." Vance looked at the notebook, then at the cold fury in Evan's eyes, and realized he was outgunned. He snapped his briefcase shut. Sarah stumbled down the stairs, fleeing Maverick's silent shadow, her face a mask of rage and terror. She didn't look at the baby as she sprinted for the Mercedes. As the car tore away, leaving a cloud of dust, Evan felt a hollow victory. He had won the battle, but as he looked at the debt notices still piled on the counter, he knew the war for the Miller legacy was only just beginning. The storm that had been brewing over the Iowa plains finally broke just after midnight, bringing with it a torrential downpour that drummed against the farmhouse roof like 1,000 frantic fingers. Inside the house, the air was thick with tension. Evan had moved Martha and the baby into the safe room, a small interior pantry reinforced with heavy oak shelving. Martha sat on a wooden crate, her knuckles white, as she clutched Leo Jr. to her chest, her lips moving in a silent, rhythmic prayer. Evan stood by the window in the darkened kitchen, his body a coiled spring of calculated aggression. He had swapped his work clothes for his old tactical gear, the matte black fabric making him nearly invisible in the gloom. He didn't use a flashlight. He let his pupils dilate, reclaiming the night eyes he had perfected in the deserts of the Middle East. Maverick stood beside him, his hackles raised in a jagged ridge along his spine. The dog's breathing was a low, steady huff, his ears rotating like radar dishes to catch the subtle sounds of tires on wet grass and the metallic snip of wire cutters. The attack began not with a bang, but with a sudden, suffocating darkness. The power lines, already strained by the wind, were severed by a tall, hulking man named Bullock. Bullock was a professional enforcer, a man built like a brick wall with a shaved head and a flattened nose that spoke of a lifetime of violence. He led a team of 3 others, desperate men hired by Sarah's creditors to clear the obstacles at the Miller farm. They approached from the dense tree line at the rear of the property, moving with a clumsy confidence, assuming the only thing standing between them and the deed was a broken old woman and a shell-shocked soldier. They were wrong. As they crossed the threshold of the backyard, they entered a kill zone Evan had mapped out with mathematical precision. Maverick was the first to strike. Evan gave a sharp, silent hand signal, and the German Shepherd vanished into the rain. 2 of the men, carrying heavy crowbars, stepped onto the rear porch, their boots crunching on the noisemakers Evan had buried. Maverick emerged from the shadows like a vengeful spirit. He didn't bark. He launched himself with a terrifying, silent velocity. His powerful jaws locked onto the lead man's forearm, the crunch of bone muffled by the thunder. Before the second man could swing his crowbar, Maverick had pivoted, knocking him off balance with the sheer force of his 90-pound frame. The dog moved with a thunderclap efficiency, taking both men down in a flurry of teeth and muscle without delivering a fatal blow, just as Evan had trained him. In the kitchen, a third intruder, a wiry man with a twitching eye named Kessler, smashed through the window. Evan didn't hesitate. He used a tactical strobe light, the blinding, high-frequency flashes disorienting Kessler instantly. In the strobing chaos, Evan moved like a blur, his hands catching Kessler in a brutal joint lock that sent the intruder screaming to the floor. But the real danger was Bullock. The hulking enforcer had circled to the side of the house, clutching a crude Molotov cocktail, a glass bottle filled with gasoline and a burning rag. He intended to burn the rats out of their hole. Bullock raised his arm to throw, the flickering orange flame illuminating his cruel, sweating face. Maverick, despite the dull ache of an old shrapnel wound in his hip that flared up in the cold rain, sensed the heat. He ignored the men groaning on the porch and vaulted over the railing. He intercepted Bullock mid-swing, his teeth sinking deep into the man's wrist. The bottle fell to the sodden grass, the flame extinguished by a puddle before it could ignite. Bullock let out a primal roar of pain, trying to shake the dog off, but Maverick held on with the stubborn grip of a creature that knew the lives of his family were at stake. Evan arrived a second later, delivering a precise strike to Bullock's temple that sent the giant crashing into the mud. The silence that followed was broken only by the wail of sirens. Moments later, 3 cruisers with flashing red and blue lights tore up the driveway, led by Sheriff Miller, no relation to Leo, but a man who had served in the same National Guard unit years ago. The sheriff was a broad-shouldered man with a silver mustache and a gaze that didn't tolerate nonsense. He found Evan standing over the bound intruders, his chest heaving, while Maverick stood guard, his coat matted with blood and rain. "You took out all 4 of them, Evan?" the sheriff asked, looking at the scene with a mixture of awe and professional respect. "They chose the wrong house, Sheriff," Evan replied, his voice cold and steady. As the deputies hauled the groaning men away, Evan knelt in the mud beside Maverick. The dog was trembling now, the adrenaline fading to reveal the sharp pain in his hind leg where the old war injury had flared. Evan pulled the dog into a tight embrace, burying his face in the wet, muddy fur. "I've got you, Maverick. You did it," he whispered. Inside the house, the lights flickered back on as the sheriff's men restored the lines. Martha emerged from the pantry, the baby asleep in her arms, her eyes filled with a terrifying gratitude. Evan looked at his hands, still stained with the grit of the fight, and then at the woman and child he had saved. He realized then that the ghosts of Fallujah had finally stopped screaming. This wasn't a tragedy he had failed to prevent. This was a victory he had earned. He wasn't just a survivor of a past war. He was the commander of a new one, and he would never let the shadows touch this family again. The legal storm that had threatened to swallow the Miller farm dissipated as quickly as the rain clouds over the Iowa plains. With Sarah's direct involvement in the attempted extortion and her history of child endangerment laid bare by the sheriff's investigation, the courts acted with uncharacteristic speed. Sarah was officially stripped of her parental rights, facing a long road of legal reckoning for her abandonment of Leo Jr. and her ties to Marcus's criminal enforcers. Marcus himself, the predatory shark, found his development empire crumbling under the weight of racketeering charges, ensuring that the shadows he cast would never again darken Martha's doorstep. The property taxes were settled through a veterans relief fund that Evan had quietly mobilized, turning the farm from a liability into a sanctuary. Cedar Creek didn't just return to normal, it found a new heartbeat. The Miller farmstead was designated as a local landmark, a living tribute to Leo's service. But for Evan, it became something much deeper, a home he no longer felt he had to earn through blood. Evan Miller officially moved his belongings from the tent into the small workshop adjacent to the barn. He didn't just fix engines anymore, he founded Maverick and Friends, a non-profit center dedicated to training service dogs for veterans struggling with the same invisible wounds that had once nearly broken him. His reputation as a man who understood both the darkness of war and the light of loyalty drew people from across the state. One of the first volunteers was Silas, the old veteran from the diner. Despite his gnarled hands, Silas proved to be a master at grooming. His calm, rumbling voice, a natural balm for the more anxious pups. Silas walked with a slight limp, but his eyes were no longer just observant. They were filled with a renewed sense of duty. Evan, too, had changed. The rigid, lighthouse-sturdy man now moved with a relaxed grace. The storm cloud blue of his eyes had cleared, reflecting the wide-open sky of a man who had finally made peace with his ghosts. Martha Miller underwent a transformation of her own. With the stress of the debt lifted, and Evan taking on the heavy labor, the light returned to her parchment-colored skin. She began tending to her rose bushes again, her arthritic hands moving with a slow, careful love. She was no longer a gaunt shadow of a woman. She was the matriarch of a makeshift family that had been forged in the fires of betrayal. She became a grandmother, not just to Leo Jr., but to every wounded soldier who walked through Evan's gates seeking help. The house, once a tomb of sour milk and silence, now smelled of fresh pine, baked bread, and the soft, powdery scent of a thriving infant. Maverick, the notched-eared warrior, had also transitioned into a new role. He was the lead instructor of the pack, a 10-year-old soul in a 5-year-old body, who knew exactly when a human needed a firm nudge or a silent companion. He was no longer a living shadow of Fallujah. He was the soul of Cedar Creek. He moved with a slight stiffness in his hind leg on cold mornings, a reminder of the night he stood against the darkness. But his spirit was unyielding. He had traded the lethal corridors of foreign lands for the soft grass of the Iowa fields, and he seemed to know that his watch, while never truly over, was now one of peace. The final morning of the harvest arrived with a warmth that felt like a blessing. The sun spilled over the horizon, turning the tall corn stalks into a sea of shimmering gold. Evan stood on the porch, his sleeves rolled up, watching as the mist lifted from the valley. Inside, he had just finished a sacred task. Beside the framed portrait of Leo, showing him in his dress blues, a wide, cocky grin on his face, Evan had hung the silver star and the brass compass. The wall was no longer a place of rectangular shadows and loss. It was a shrine of honor. For the first time in years, the nightmares hadn't come. The screams of the past had been drowned out by the gentle, rhythmic sounds of a household at rest. Leo Jr., now nearly a year old, and a mirror image of his father with bright, curious eyes and a tuft of sandy hair, Chup Chung stepped out onto the lush, green Tamkaw. He was wearing a small pair of denim overalls, his tiny legs wobbling with the monumental effort of his first steps. Every time he faltered, he reached out a small hand, burying his fingers into Maverick's thick, tan and black fur. Maverick walked beside him with agonizing slowness, acting as a living, breathing handrail, his tail swaying in a slow, protective arc. The child let out a bubbly laugh as he successfully navigated the distance from the porch to the garden gate, a victory as great as any won on a battlefield. Martha watched from the doorway, a soft smile playing on her lips, her hands resting on the doorframe. She no longer feared being forced to leave. Evan walked down the steps and knelt in the grass beside his dog. He rested his forehead against Maverick's, breathing in the scent of the earth and the dog's warmth. The silence of the morning was no longer heavy or stagnant. It was full of life. Evan looked out at the harvesters in the distance, then back at the little boy who carried his best friend's name and his best friend's future. "We're home, buddy," Evan whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he finally allowed himself to feel. "We're finally home." Maverick didn't need a hand signal to understand. He let out a deep, contented sigh and licked Evan's cheek before turning back to watch Leo Jr. attempt another step. The journey of the soldiers who had returned from the shadows had reached its end, not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, golden light of a promise kept. This story of Evan and Maverick reminds us that no matter how far we wander into the shadows of our past, we are never truly beyond the reach of grace. Redemption often doesn't come in the way we expect. It doesn't always arrive with a grand parade or a medal of honor. Sometimes it shows up as a quiet responsibility, a leaky roof that needs fixing, or a tiny hand reaching out to touch a scarred soul. In our daily lives, we all carry burdens that no one else can see. We have all stood at doorways of regret, wondering if we still have a purpose. But like Evan, we must learn that our greatest strength isn't found in what we have survived, but in who we choose to protect. Faith is about showing up when it is easier to walk away. It is about believing that a broken house can become a home again, and that a weary heart can find a new reason to beat. If this story touched your heart today, please share it with someone who might be fighting a silent battle of their own. Let them know they are not alone. Leave a comment below telling us what this journey meant to you, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to walk these paths of hope and courage together. May God bless you and your family. May He protect your home, guide your steps through the mist, and give you the strength to keep your promises. May He watch over those who stand guard beside you, seen or unseen, and fill your heart with the peace that passes all understanding. If you believe that love can rebuild what was broken, type Amen in the comments. Thank you for listening. I will see you in the next one.